David Bowie never stayed the same for long, not because he was searching, but because he refused to be defined. Where most artists build an identity and hold on to it, Bowie seemed to shed his again and again. From Ziggy Stardust to the thin white Duke, and eventually into something almost intangible. But there's a moment when that constant transformation becomes something else, something darker, more distant. And nowhere is that shift more palpable than in Berlin. Because what happens there doesn't just change Bowie, it changes what he no longer needs to be. Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of We're Only in It for the Music, a YouTube series that takes you through the musical universe, from ABBA to Zappa and everything in between and beyond. Click the like and subscribe buttons, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an episode. But enough of that, never mind the bollocks. We're only in it for the music. This is Chapter 2 of the David Bowie artist arc. In the previous episode, we saw how the man who sold the world introduced Bowie to the world in 4 entirely different forms. But today, we take a leap into the second half of the 1970s, into a city that at the time was just as divided as Bowie himself, West Berlin. A place where, alongside Iggy Pop and Brian Eno, he wouldn't just reinvent his sound, but begin to uncover what remains when everything else is stripped away. By the mid-1970s, David Bowie had already gone through more transformations than most artists do in a lifetime. After the glam rock of Ziggy Stardust came a more experimental phase with Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs, before he fully immersed himself in the sound of Philadelphia's soul. Plastic soul, he called it, half in jest. But young Americans hit its mark. Bowie slipped effortlessly from rock frontman into soul crooner. Yet as his music became more controlled, more refined, he himself was slipping further out of control. In Los Angeles, where he settled after his East Coast success, his growing cocaine addiction began to take its toll. Legend has it he survived on a diet of milk, cocaine, and red peppers. In a 1987 interview, Bowie later reflected, "I was so blocked, so stoned. It's quite a casualty case, isn't it? I'm amazed I came out of that period. Honest. When I see that now, I cannot believe I survived it. I was so close to really throwing myself away physically, completely." It was also there that he worked on the film The Man Who Fell to Earth. Although he never completed its soundtrack, the ideas he explored during that time would later resurface, most notably on Low. At the same time, he was working on what might be his most fractured record, Station to Station. Bowie would later claim he remembered almost nothing of the sessions. And yet, something unmistakable is happening on that album. Not just musically, but personally. Because this is where his next alter ego emerges. The thin white Duke, a cold, distant figure, suspended somewhere between control and total disintegration. The soul and funk influences are still there, but now something else seeps in. Something European. You can hear it in the opening of the title track. The mechanical precision of Kraftwerk. As if Bowie is leaving Los Angeles behind and boarding a trans-Europe express toward something unknown. He absorbs these new influences like a sponge. Bands like New, Tangerine Dream begin to form a new blueprint. And that blueprint points in only one direction, back to Europe. Together with his longtime friend Iggy Pop, whom he had reconnected with in LA, Bowie decides to go on tour. In London, he crosses paths with former Roxy Music keyboardist Brian Eno, whose ambient work had deeply inspired him. And in that moment, the pieces begin to fall into place. But first, he has to spiral further. And as he does, something new begins to take shape behind the scenes. That summer, he booked studio time at Château de Hérouville, just outside Paris, not for himself, but for Iggy Pop. What emerged there would become The Idiot, an album where Bowie wrote the music and Iggy supplied the words. At least that's how the story's usually told, because in reality, the lines were far less clear. The Idiot sounds like something new, something Bowie himself hadn't fully revealed yet, where Station to Station still feels like a transition. This feels like a destination. Cold, mechanical, European. The outlines of what would later become his Berlin Trilogy are already fully audible here. The album was eventually mixed at the Hansa Ton studio in Kreuzberg, in the heart of West Berlin, with Tony Visconti behind the desk. And that's where something shifts. For the first time, Berlin is no longer an idea, but a place, a refuge. For Bowie and Iggy, the city becomes a way out from the fame, the chaos, and the drugs. So they decide to stay. By August, The Idiot is finished. But Bowie makes one final strategic decision. He wants his own album to come out first. Not because The Idiot matters less, but because it stands too close to him. As Chateau d'Hérouville owner Laurent Thibault would later put it, Bowie didn't want people to think he was inspired by Iggy, when in reality, it was all the same thing. And even visually, you can already see the lines beginning to converge. The cover of The Idiot, with its frozen, distorted pose, feels almost like a study, a prelude, to what would later appear on Heroes. The same hand, the same tension. But where Iggy still seems trapped inside the pose, Bowie would later stand and face you. And then we arrive at Low, the first chapter of what would later be known as the Berlin Trilogy. Except, there's a problem. Low wasn't recorded in Berlin at all. Most of the album takes shape in France, once again at Chateau d'Hérouville, and yet it sounds as if it was born in the middle of a cold, divided city, as if David Bowie is already there. Even though he hasn't physically arrived yet, that's no coincidence. Because Low isn't a response to Berlin, it's a preparation. After the chaos of Los Angeles and the first experiments on The Idiot, Bowie begins to strip things back for real. Structures grow shorter, lyrics fade into the background, and atmosphere starts to matter more than form. For the first time in a long while, he's working without drugs, and that, in itself, unsettles him, as if he's no longer sure the music will come. And yet, something entirely new begins to emerge. Together with Brian Eno and producer Tony Visconti, he develops a completely different way of working, no longer driven by control, but by experiment, chance, and limitation. The sound of the album turns cold, mechanical. Side A is made up of short, fragmented songs, restless, unresolved. But then, something shifts. Side B almost erases Bowie entirely. Instrumentals, spacious, distant, as if he's slowly removing himself from his own music. And it's precisely there that something new takes shape, because by the time Low is completed, the project finally moves to Berlin, where the final recordings take place at the Hansa Ton studio. Not as a starting point, but as a destination. Low is not a Berlin album, it's the journey toward it. And by the time Bowie finally arrives in that city, he's no longer the same artist. The cover of Low shows Bowie in profile, just like on Station to Station. A still frame from the film The Man Who Fell to Earth, turned away, at a distance. Even the title itself is a visual pun, low profile, as if Bowie is deliberately making himself smaller and slowly beginning to disappear. But before David Bowie takes his next step, he helps Iggy Pop find his way back first. Together, they return to Berlin, where they begin work on Iggy's second album, Lust for Life. In contrast to the dark, introspective atmosphere of Low, this record feels immediate, more energetic, almost relieved, as if the fog is slowly lifting. But that energy isn't a distraction. It's part of the same process. Because while Bowie is helping Iggy rebuild himself, he's quietly doing the same. And strikingly, songs from this period would continue to echo through Bowie's own work for years to come, from China Girl to Tonight. And in the process, something begins to shift. Because for the first time in years, Bowie isn't just reacting anymore, he's ready to define what comes next. And then, David arrives in Berlin. For the first time, he is no longer in transit, but fully inside the place his music had been pointing toward all along. At the Hansa Ton studio, just a stone's throw from the Berlin Wall, he records the album where everything comes together, Heroes. This time, not in France, not half in motion, but entirely here. And you can hear it. Where Low felt distant and introspective, Heroes is immediate, more emotional, as if everything that had been stripped away is now coming back together. Low was the unraveling. Heroes is the moment everything aligns. The environment plays a crucial role in that transformation. From the studio, Bowie and his band look out onto the wall. Barbed wire, watchtowers, armed guards. A constant reminder of division, of tension. And yet, in that very setting, something unexpected emerges. Not distance, but connection. Not coldness, but emotion. Together with Brian Eno and producer Tony Visconti, Bowie builds on the sound of Low, but this time with more force, more conviction. And at the center of it all is one song. The title track, Heroes. For the recording, Visconti placed multiple microphones at different distances. The louder Bowie sang, the further the next microphone would open, as if he had to break through space itself just to be heard. A song born from a simple moment. Two people by the wall. Yet it grows into something much larger. No grand narrative, no heroic deeds, just the idea that even if only for one day, you can be someone else, a hero. Heroes is no longer about escape. It's about acceptance of where he is, of who he has become. And maybe for the first time, Bowie doesn't sound like someone trying to disappear, but like someone choosing to remain. The wailing guitar of Robert Fripp doesn't just sit in the mix, it cuts straight through it, pushing the song into something far more urgent, more human. On the cover of Heroes, Bowie looks directly at you. The pose, inspired by expressionist art, is tense, almost distorted. Where Low kept its distance, he now stands at the center, present, as if he's shaping himself all over again. And at the same time, the visual quietly echoes back to Iggy Pop's The Idiot, closing a loop that had been unfolding all along. After Heroes, Bowie leaves Berlin, if only for a while. In New York, he records the narration for Peter and the Wolf, an unexpected detour, almost childlike, in contrast to everything that came before. But maybe that's exactly what's needed. A moment of distance, because the next phase no longer belongs to Berlin. For the first time in years, Bowie isn't disappearing anymore. And standing still was never part of the plan. Because what comes next isn't about finding himself, but about where he goes from here. And then comes the third chapter, Lodger, where Berlin turned inward on Heroes. Lodger opens the door back out again. And once more, something strange happens. Because just like Low, this album wasn't recorded in Berlin either. Not at Hansa, not by the wall, but in Switzerland and New York. So why does it still belong to that same trilogy? Because Lodger isn't the sound of Berlin, it's what comes after it, where Low was the journey. And Heroes, the moment everything aligned, Lodger is the movement that follows. Bowie is no longer trapped inside himself. He's moving outward again, back into the world, and you can hear it. No longer fragments and distance, but songs, rhythm, energy, influences from everywhere. As if everything he stripped away in Berlin, he's now trying to rebuild. But something else has shifted too. Although Brian Eno's role was reduced compared to Low and Heroes, he still contributed ideas and creative input to Lodger. And you can hear it immediately. Where Low and Heroes revolved around atmosphere, fragmentation, and distance, this is about movement, about songs, about the outside world pushing in, rhythms, cultures, sounds from everywhere. It's music that anticipates what artists like Peter Gabriel and David Byrne would later explore more fully. As if Bowie opens the door, and others only walk through it years later, with Graceland by Paul Simon as perhaps the most successful example. And then there's the cover of Lodger, a distorted image, Bowie, in an unnatural pose, almost off balance, as if he's trying to reposition himself, but hasn't quite figured out how yet. But that's not the full picture, because Lodger is a gatefold, and when you open it, you finally see what's really happening. No longer a single frozen image, but fragments, body parts, moments that don't quite align, as if Bowie has taken himself apart and is trying to put himself back together again. No longer one identity, but a collection of pieces, still in motion. Maybe David Bowie never had a single identity. But in Berlin, he learned he didn't need one. What Bowie found there wasn't a new persona, but the freedom to exist without one. The Berlin period would go on to shape artists like Joy Division, Depeche Mode, and U2. Some of them would later travel to Berlin in search of inspiration, and perhaps something of Bowie himself. After Lodger, that Berlin chapter comes to a close. But with Bowie, an ending is never stillness, because before one phase has fully settled, the next is already beginning to take shape. The 1980s, and an album that would shift everything once again. Scary monsters and super creeps. And once again, he becomes something new. And with David Bowie leaving Berlin, we close Chapter 2 of the artist arc, and Season 2 along with it. Thank you for watching, for commenting, and above all, for growing with this channel. We've now passed 43 episodes and 100 plus subscribers. Maybe still just the beginning, but one I'm genuinely proud of. This season, we really explored every corner, from Jagged Little Pill to Christmas classics, from Otis Redding to Amy Winehouse, from Chris Rea to John Coltrane, from Johnny Mitchell to Lana Del Rey, and even Taylor Swift. And that range, that openness, that stays. Because in Season 3, we're taking the next step, with even more focus on the stories behind the music. But for now, this was Bowie, Berlin, and beyond. I'm especially curious to hear your take. What's your favorite album from the trilogy? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to vote in the poll over on the community tab. You can also check out the Spotify playlist featuring highlights from Bowie and Iggy Pop's Berlin period. Follow the channel on Facebook and Instagram for updates, because I will follow you if you follow me. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching. See you next season. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.